That's ready. We can't display your shared content. Make sure you have permission to share.
Oh, odd. Let's, I just made you presenter, so we'll see if that works.
Okay. All right. Try again. Unable to share at this time. Huh.
Oh, weird. Do you want to email me your slide
Sure.
deck and I can share? I don't
Yep.
usually have this problem with WebEx.
Yeah. I don't have an account. I'm just like logged in as a guest. Maybe that's
Yeah.
why. All right. All right, Josie. Sorry, everybody. Give me a sec. In the meantime, I'll play with it. Maybe it's just a setting. All right. I just sent them to you. Let me see.
I'm still just waiting on them to come through.
Oh, this isn't unverified.
Yeah, WebEx did this new thing like a few months ago where now everybody shows up as unverified.
Oh, okay. I just didn't know if that had anything to do with it. Hmm.
Okay, I was able to
Oh,
also
just
make you a
transferred.
host.
Okay, hang on. I just got the notification just popped up that I'm now the. Ah, I think it's going to work now.
Yay.
Okay. Can you guys see my screen?
No.
Not yet. Okay. I think it's going. All right. Can you see it now?
Yay. Yes.
Yay. Okay. All right.
Yeah,
There
we
we
can see
go.
it.
All right. Perfect. All right. So now you can see the slides. I think it just took a minute to like come through.
Yes, we see them.
All right. Perfect. All right. So thanks, everybody. So as Josie said, we're going to kind of just run through the basics of consenting and biomedical research. And these slides are really just meant to give a very broad stroke things to think about depending on your role and sort of the administrative side of consenting. Okay. So what we're going to do is this outline shows the main topics we're going to touch on briefly. And we'll share these slides because I hope that they'll just serve as a future reference for you as well. So you don't have to, don't worry about remembering all the text because there is a lot. Okay. So that's these 7 topics that we're going to go over. All right. So again, just a very brief introduction to the regulations about informed consent. So if you're not familiar with the regulations, they're noted here. You really should be familiar with them, based on your role as a research coordinator, project manager, whatever your aspects are. What you need to know here is just that there's other reasons the regulations are important, right? So what is going to be necessary in terms of training? What is your role on this study? What trainings does your institution offer? What about the rest of your team? So it's not just how to develop the form that we need to know what the regulations are all about, okay? And I will say throughout this, yell, holler if you have a question. Happy to stop and take some tangents if we have to. All right, so here's a little history fun fact I want you guys to think about and see if you can figure it out. So this event occurred in 1902 in DC. Harvey Wiley was an active participant, put him that way. He was from Purdue, but he was working at the Department of Agriculture. And actually now in the Smithsonian, there's this quote. So if you just take a quick moment to look it over, let me know if you know what all of this is referring to. And just by the hints on the left, somebody may already know. Does anybody have any clues? Any thoughts? Right. So what this is all talking about is what's called the poison squad. So this was noted as the first food testing study that occurred way back in 1902. And it actually prompted the creation of the FDA. So there is a PBS special on it. There's a book about it. It's a really interesting read to understand why informed consent in research became so important, because obviously at this time it did not exist. All right, so where did we get to? So obviously, fast forward, we've got our guidance and our documentation that tells us what we need to do. So this is just a short screenshot of the top of the guidance document. And what these next few slides are going to do is they're just going to talk about these tenets of consent. And what I want you to do is just take away from these next few slides is, are these concepts or tenets understandable in my consent form, right? Your template that you use will obviously include all of these, but is the language appropriate for your population and your type of study, okay? So we'll go through these pretty quickly. But obviously, this is what led us all the way to where we are today and established the principles and guidance. So again, something important to know about. You should from your city training. But voluntary choice. Obviously, we do not want to do these things, right? We don't want to coerce, manipulate, force someone. And how do we avoid those things, right? How are these means of distress or duress avoided? The other tenet is understanding, right? So again, how do we ensure that our participants understand what we're trying to convey? And how do we document that? Well, with our written consent form. And therapeutic conception. Again, we're doing, depending on the type of research you're doing, this is especially important in clinical trials, but how do you avoid that concept, right? What does our consent form do to make sure that this is not a misunderstanding by our research subjects? All right, so that's the really quick sort of overview in terms of background and sort of things to think about or investigate as you're drafting your consent forms. So what about all the populations that we serve? What do we do? And I think the most important thing here is like to do your homework, right? So if you are enrolling adults, so what is the age of majority? That is their legal ability to provide you consent to participate. In most states, it's 18, some it's not. Do you have a multi-site study going on? Do you know what your local state rules are in terms of those states? What are their regulations? And what about international studies? So it's 16 in most other countries, not 18 or 19. So again, just thinking about it, just because you have adults in our minds, we can't just say, oh, 18 and go from there. What's also really important is in terms of future knowledge, I know in our studies in particular, for the most part, don't involve these populations or types of research. But if you're doing any mental health research, even infectious disease, public health type studies, reproductive health, then their ability to consent, that age may differ because depending on the type of study, they can consent to the medical care that may be involved in that trial. So if you're doing anything around homelessness or juvenile adjudication or birth control, so again, the message here is just do your homework. We're all pretty used to kids and minors. Obviously, what the definition is from the federal regulations is important, but also what's going to happen is your IRB is going to determine what that age is, right? So they have to follow this federal regulation to determine in their mind what serves as this age that children can consent to research. And it's going to differ by your institution. So again, figure that out. You know, at Penn, we start at 8. Other institutions start at 7. Some don't start till 13. And what then tends to happen is based on that age determination, and your IRB is going to tell you that you may end up with 2 different forms, right? One for the younger group with a different reading level, one for the older kids, you know, again, with a different reading level. So it's just important. These are the kinds of things to take into consideration and to check your templates. Know what your IRB is going to require of you. So this is just another slide to think about what other considerations. If my study is enrolling minors, what do I need to worry about in terms of obtaining their consent and or parental permission based on the study? So what the different study activities are going to matter and how you obtain that assent or parental permission, what their custody status is, what the language needs to be around those activities, the custody status, also the mandatory reporting laws, what they are, what language will need to be in the consent if you're enrolling minors. And if emancipation is an issue, so to speak. So again, as I said before, depending on your type of study, there is a legal versus a medical definition of emancipation. So again, these are just things you should be aware of, take into consideration when you're developing your consent forms, and know what the differences are among them. All right, so what do the regulations say? Do the minors, you know, does a minor always have to provide consent or sorry, assent? It depends, right? Again, that's what your IRB is going to tell you. And there'll be some slides in a minute that sort of differentiate that, okay? And what I try to do is there's a lot of text on these slides. So if it's highlighted in a color, it's just kind of something to think about, okay? So what your IRB is first going to do is utilizing the regulations in this subpart G, they're going to determine what type of study you have. So this is going to be, you know, in your initial review, your IRB is going to say, okay, are you 404, 405, 406, or 47? And you can find that in the initial IRB approval letter if you're coming into a study, or if you're submitting for the first time and you get that initial approval back, that's where you're going to find this guidance from the IRB. And just, this is another way to look at it, but this is why it matters, right? So do you need a parent signature, just one, or do you need 2? And if you need 2, what are sort of the regulations around that in terms of, well, what type of documentation or proof do I need if my study gets a 407 classification, but only one parent's at the bedside? Do I have to actually have physical paperwork documentation in the medical record that second parent is not available for one of these reasons? So again, it's just all the things you got to think about as you're going into drafting your consents, being prepared. Any questions about any of that so far? Hopefully none of this is new. All right. So again, these are just other populations depending on your type of study. I just wanted to throw it in here because you never know what you're going to do in the future. But these are other populations that fall under Subpart D, where our minors and kids fall, that lack that ability to provide fully informed consent some way or another. All right, so what if our population isn't fluent in English? What do we need to do? Again, a lot of text here, but focusing on what the regulations say is that it's got to be prospective and they should be incidentally encountered. So what exactly does that mean? And sort of really how is that defined? And we will talk about translation later. Again, FDA regulations, they have their own set of code. If you're doing an FDA study and you're trying to develop your consents or assent forms, parental permission forms, make sure you're knowing what their guidance states, which is pretty much identical, but slightly different. All right, again, these are 2 slides I quickly threw in there because from a future research perspective, or maybe you're developing studies right now, back when we got the revised common rule, they added this broad consent concept. So hopefully you've heard about it. It's this alternative consent process. Again, it can only be used in certain circumstances or yet to be specified research. And there's a lot of good literature now coming out about it. So again, just a plug for that. It may be a way to set up your trial or multiple trials going on in your unit. And this just shows you sort of what those features are, and again, what you would need to include in that broad consent, because the regulations don't define a template similar to what they do for all our other forms of consent. And these highlights are just where it's different than our standard consent template that we're all familiar with. All right, so now the nitty-gritty, you're ready to get started. I need to draft these consent forms. I need to review them. What am I going to do? So obviously the first steps, know your protocol, know your population, know the type of study. Is it a clinical trial or observational? What is that study category that my IRB defined my study as, that we talked about earlier? What's the design? Is it single site, multi-site? Is it a randomized trial? Again, that language is going to matter in your consent forms. And then go find your available templates, whether that's from your university. If you're university affiliated, they may have different ones than your hospital. Your IRB, depending on who that is, whether it's your university or hospital, whether it's a private IRB, or your sponsor. Not assuming that we're all doing NIH, federally funded trials. Your sponsor may have a template that they want you to use. Again, there's lots of types of informed consent. Not going to get into any of these today. What we're just going to focus on is written consent. But just as you should know that there are many ways, to obtain consent. All right, so again, the document. What are we trying to do? Your primary source should be your institution. Do your research online. There's some other websites that I like to go to. I'm drafting a consent form, taking my template for my institution, comparing that. University of Utah is a great resource. The WHO, the FDA, but there's a lot of institutions that have really robust websites, and it's always good to read other language. What do other people say? How do they describe it? How do they make assent forms easy to read for kids? All those types of things. And then again, with your template, you got to discuss with your IRB sort of what's allowed. Do they like checkboxes or not? Some IRBs like them, some don't. Penn hates them, but I need to use them sometimes. So what do? Do they like you to have an opt-in or an opt-out preference? Again, they're going to give you that guidance. What about version control? So you've submitted for your initial review, and for whatever reason, it may be several months later, you might be ready now to get your study started. Check your versions. Did your IRB make any changes? Did the federal regulations change? And something you had in your consent form is different. Some IRBs are really good at sending out notifications to you, sending out blasts that say, hey, the template has changed. If this is applicable to you, go check your consent form. Sometimes they're not. So it's on you to make sure you know. And obviously, if it's federally funded versus industry sponsored, that's going to matter, where your templates are coming from. These are just screenshots. They're all the tools that are available online. So obviously, you should find a template from your university or your hospital, whatever your IRB of record is, that gives you this template that has, these directions, right? How do I draft a consent from your template? There's the regulations, there's other flow charts you can find online. Your Office of Research may have guidance or helpful tips and tricks, but I find the best thing to do is just kind of do a search and see what's out there. All right, so not only in consent, obviously you need to get HIPAA authorization to use that PHI, right? So this is just the background, but what we're concerned about is, do I have a separate authorization form? Can it be combined with my informed consent? These are things that you'll be learning as you're starting to develop your documents, and where are they available? Again, your hospital, if you're university affiliated, your university may have one standard sort of HIPAA form for research. Your hospital may have another one that they've sort of blended medical and research HIPAA authorization for. So it's just your job to find out, what you need to do to use and what your IRB prefers. And then again, keeping in mind, is it a multi-site study, single site study? What are you going to need to sort of tackle? And know that the rules and regulations across states differ. Those of you from California that are here know you have a standalone one. You also have your Bill of Rights. And in Pennsylvania, we have like nothing. So you just need to know. And obviously, you should know where you're situated in your university or your hospital. If you're in a hospital, obviously, you're a covered entity. And from a HIPAA language perspective, if you're at a university, it depends where you're sitting. So for me personally, I sit in the School of Nursing. My research that I'm managing is all run out of School of Medicines. So they're a covered entity. I'm not particularly, my school isn't. But how does that affect me drafting consent forms for a study run out of the School of Nursing? So those are just all the things to sort of think about. And then how you're transmitting if you have to transmit consent forms. These are just the elements. Again, they're the core elements that we should sort of all be familiar with. But what you want to make sure is, depending on where you're grabbing that template from, are these things included. And if you have a standalone document, you don't want them repeated in both places, right? You don't want to confuse the subjects. So you want to cross-reference and make sure, well, if my HIPAA elements are in my standalone HIPAA, then I don't need them in my consent form. Or if it's in both, what do you need to do? Again, thinking about sort of the general elements, right? It has to be prospectively obtained. The person has to have sufficient time to decide. It has to be in a language that's understandable. And the regulations say this is like this reasonable person has to be able to make a decision based on the form that you've just drafted and had approved. But then it doesn't really tell you what a reasonable person is. So that's where you work with your IRB and the reading language or the reading level, etc., to determine that. Again, none of this should be new information. This is just to say that the elements are out there and there are really good resources on how to make them, reader friendly. How do you make them so that your participants understand based on your population? I mean, there's even YouTube videos you can watch. So, um, in terms of the additional elements to remember, so we have the revised common rule that now requires the research summary. So making sure that's on all of your templates. The standard of care definitions versus research. And Smart IRB actually had a really good call yesterday about, standard of care and how it differs. What the number of subjects are in your study, fetus work, if you're doing that type of study, safety for your drug and devices, the certificate of confidentiality, that is now automatically granted for all NIH studies. You don't actually have to go apply for one anymore. But is that an element that needs to be in your consent form? The contact information. Many IRBs now require two forms of contact. So it has to be the PI for certain questions and your IRB for other questions. So again, just making sure you're considering all of the standard elements, but these additional things that might pop up that you need to include on your consent form. This everyday language rule, the font size, the reading level, how to break up your sentences. This 15 words or less is sort of standard that they say helps to reduce reading level. Again, there's literature out there that you can read on how to make these consent forms better. And that's a whole another topic that you could spend a lot of time on. So this slide is just to remind you that you're always going to go back to your IRB. Sort of what are their rules for consents? It may say it in their template and their instructions, but what I have found is that as you're passing around documents for review, so you and your PI are working on the consent form, you're drafting it, getting it ready, sharing it back and forth by email, maybe you're uploading it to Box, downloading it, somebody else is uploading it again. Did your fonts change? Did the spacing change? So these are all the little things to sort of like pay attention to, right? What does your IRB want? And making sure you get it to that point prior to submission. Even things like justification, blank spacing. Can you use capital letters? Can you not? Can you use underlining? Sort of like what do they dictate to you? All right, and lastly, there may be these supplemental materials that you have to provide. So again, your IRB should inform you if you have to, but it may depend on your type of study. Do you need a medical release for records? How do you obtain that? How do you get consent to do it? Do you have to hand it out at consent? Can you do it later? Do you have sub-studies or ancillary studies going on? Do you have an IP or do you have study brochures that need to go out? You can even do informational videos. So you can direct your subjects to a video to watch. There's all different ways. So what supplemental materials are you going to need? And thinking about those as you're drafting the consent. All right, and obviously if you need a parental permission, it's pretty much the same standard as an informed consent. But what are the issues? Obviously the consent administration will differ, and Kirsten will talk about that. But just thinking about it in terms of drafting your forms and how they're going to be needed. Maybe you do use a multimedia presentation, for instance, or you do a different staged consent form process. So just to think about those things. Don't just take your adult informed consent form and reword it for a parental. It doesn't always work. With Ascent, they're going to have their own rules and guidelines, right? Your IRB, again, is going to say what to do, but the regulations don't really specify like general elements or specific elements like they do for an adult. Generally, IRBs tend to say second or third grade reading level. Some let you use pictures, icons, and videos. Some don't. You've got to find out. And although we like to think of it as an abbreviated version of an adult or parental permission, that isn't always necessarily the case. So again, keeping these considerations in mind and what you need to do to take these consent forms but turn it into an assent. Take the time. All right, good. All right, so what if you want to use a short form? So we talked a little bit about what the regulations say on if you have encounter a population that does not speak English. So you may have already determined that you know your protocol is going to enroll individuals that do not speak English. So translation is one thing, and we'll talk about that in a second. But what if you don't have that? Sort of what are the rules around using a short form? So the regulations say one thing, being understandable, having a reliable interpreter, and sort of how the presentation should go. But what does your IRB say? How many times can you use a short form? How do you get permission to use a short form? Do you have to file an exception request? Can you just use it? Pull it off the website, use it, and that's that, and your IRB doesn't really monitor it. So again, just this is the plug to think about what you're going to need to know if you're going to be using a short form and sort of like where to find them. All right. So your study's enrolling English and Spanish. It was written in the protocol, and you're like, okay, now what? You have to translate your document. Do you have the money for that? Is it available in your budget? How much is available? What does your local guidance or IRB tell you? Do you have to have it done professionally with a certificate of translation? Can a layperson do it with back and forth documentation? So again, you need to determine those things before you can move forward. And at what point do you get an IRB approved? Are you getting it approved with your initial submission for your informed consents? Going to do this a little bit later, maybe when you investigate this information. And sometimes you can even find components of the forms that are already translated, whether that's your HIPAA sections, whether that's certain consent form components. Your institution may already have those translated. So you can do your research and maybe you find it. And again, is it a multi-site study? Is it a single site study? Those are financial and budget constraints and formatting considerations. And lastly, you're not just developing the forms, right? You have to think about the process as you're doing this. So what is the availability to do translation? Do you have a medical translation team? Can you use that for research? Some hospitals let you, some don't. And what is their availability? And what does your IRB say in terms of who can conduct your consent when you're using a translated form? So I put this in here because, again, you've spent all this time figuring out how am I going to develop these forms? What are the things I need to think about? And then you see the signature page, and it may be this is part of the template from your IRB, but they also kind of like throw in these like little snippets of rules sometimes. So you just need to know what the preferences are of your IRB. And this is the page that I actually find changes the most often from your institutional template. So all of a sudden something happens, whether it's an audit finding, whether it's a change in the regulations, whatever it is. At least here at Penn, this has changed several times over the years. So what I like to do is, unless my IRB is sending out notifications that this aspect of the template has changed and the rules surrounding signature process, then on a yearly basis at continuing review, I'm always going back and checking my approved informed consent against the template of the institution that I took it from. And it's just a way to kind of check and make sure. I've had times where I had an industry sponsored study and we only had to do date, and then we suddenly also had to do time. And no one was told that. So, just making sure you're always on top of what your template says and what these components, how they're incorporated. All right. So, what if you need to do some form of electronic consent or signature on your consent form? So this is just, again, a little plug to say, what do I need to consider? What are my options for this form of consent? And what should I be thinking about? So again, regulations don't say a specific method has to be used. They do permit you to kind of use different technologies. I think what's really important is, do you have access? So there's a lot of ways that you can do this. But what does your institution have available? And what will your IRB approve for you to use? Because if you're doing all this work on developing these paper forms and your paper documents, but you might be obtaining a signature or administering consent electronically, how is that how does that affect your paper document? Because it will, because you may need to have little um, text boxes that say, you may be consented over Zoom. You may be given this information over the phone. So this is just a reminder that this is really important and you really just have to do your homework. All right, so thank goodness I'm like past this stage, running my study. What types of documentation do I need in terms of my consent forms? And obviously your PI, who their delegates are, what your delegation log says is all going to be stored there. And sort of who has that ultimate responsibility, right? How are you documenting that process? What are the ways? What's an auditor going to review? Um, you know, date, to be honest, isn't even a required element. But it's recommended so that you can confirm that they were consented prior to the beginning of a study activity, which is why some studies are particular with time, especially if randomization is involved or drug administration. But it's also not required. So the elements, the regulations don't tell us we have to have a dated consent form, but obviously it's required by the IRBs. This is just another way. Do you need to build this type of document when you're creating your consent forms? So sometimes your IRB is going to be based on your type of study. They're going to say, how are you documenting consent? Do you need some kind of quiz, understanding form? It can just be a note to file. Depends on the risk level of your study, but this is going to be something you're developing at the same time you're developing your consent forms. This is just an example of what one may look like, and just something to keep in mind. And lastly, storage. Obviously, you've done all this work. You've got these consent forms that are now signed. How do you store them? This 2LD behind two locked doors for our paper staff. Can you scan them in, keep them electronic? It all depends. You have to ask what your institution allows. And knowing retention. So the regulations state that you need to keep them for 3 years. Okay, so that's one aspect. The HIPAA privacy rule says I need to keep them for 6 years. There are actually differences between what the NIH says and what an FDA requirement says. Your local institution may also have another time frame. So it may be as high as 10 years, but you need to know because, again, you're developing all these forms. One aspect of consent creation, documentation, storage, and retention. So how it works is that the longest requirement that you fall under is what the study requirement needs to be. So if you happen to be at an institution that says you need to retain signed consent forms for 10 years, that's what you're stuck with. But if you have a 3-year regulation time frame, that's it. Nobody else has stated how long you need to keep them. That's what you're going with. However, what is this critical piece of information needed to determine retention? Does anybody know? How do I know 3 years, 6 years, 10 years? What do I need to know to determine that? Somebody has to know. Is the only question. Well, it all starts with IRB closure. So your clock starts when you close the study with your IRB. It doesn't start when you've closed to enrollment. So until you have that IRB letter that says your study is closed, that's when your roll clock starts. So you could run the study for 5 years. Maybe you have a no cost extension for 6. And then you're doing your data cleaning for the 7th year. So you're still accessing PHI. And then finally, at 7.5 years, you go and you close your study with the IRB because you've got your de-identified data set, no access to PHI anymore. You're all set and done. That's when your clock starts. So you may be looking at, 6 years, 10 years post your first 7.5. So it's just something to keep in mind. And that's it. Oh, questions, comments, thoughts?
Thanks, Amy. Good information. We've kind of on the side, a couple of us is, well, somebody had suggested maybe we do a separate webinar at some point about just document storage, and like
Totally. You totally
retention
could.
and like
Yep.
study closeout, and because that's like a whole beast. I will say, as
Mm-hmm.
far as I feel like using an interpreter and translation is a beast that's coming up more and more. Like I feel like it used
Yes,
to
it is.
be that using a short form was pretty acceptable across the board, and I think seems to be that IRBs are getting more strict, and there's more of um, an attitude of um, increasing accessibility to all populations, right? So
Yep.
in
Yep.
general, what IRBs want now is that if you are going into a study and you anticipate enrolling somebody in a given language or population, they want you to have it the full
Yep.
translation
Mm-hmm.
at the get-go.
Yep.
I won't say that's like every IRB, but that's the general attitude right now. And more IRBs are having pretty strict limits on how many times you can use a short form.
Yep.
So, and especially then if you're doing a multi-center study, you're participating in one or you're running one.
Yep.
Um, if you're participating in one, is there a different, does your IRB require something different than the single IRB? And is your IRB actually fully relying on that IRB, or do you have to choose like the more restrict measure between your IRB and the single IRB? So like those are like, I think just bigger things that are coming up, and it's obviously a problem with funding because we don't have a lot of funding in critical care, but it's becoming a mainstay that we translate as much as possible so that we're not systematically excluding populations of people.
Right.
So anyway,
Right.
that's
Well,
just like
because
my 10
yeah,
cents on
no,
that.
for sure. Because that's what the regulations say, right?
Yeah.
The regulations say you have to prospectively determine who you might approach. And short forms are only if they're incidentally encountered, I think is the wording, right?
Right.
It's not
Right.
supposed to be like, oh, that's my backup, right? It's supposed to be like, no. So for sure. And that's a whole nother topic. I mean, I hope all I tried to do today was really like throw out all those layers of things to think about. Um, because almost any one of them could be a standalone topic,
Yeah,
right?
for sure.
So yeah, it's it can be much more time consuming than I think PIs tend to think about, and a lot more back and forth with your IRBs. So, so hopefully it was a lot to, hopefully none of it was new, but hopefully it's a lot to kind of think about and chew on because it is it is always changing, like Josie said. You know, at Penn, we can use a short form 3 times. But they don't even define what that 3 times is. Is that the length of the study? Is that a calendar year? Is that a budget year? Is that so? Yeah, it's really hard.
Well, if there aren't any other questions, then thank you so much, Amy, for putting this
Sure.
together today. And we'll get the slides sent around through the network email.
Cool. Yeah. Did you get my email?
Yeah, I did.
Okay, good. Yeah.
All
All
right.
right.
Have a
Thanks,
great rest of
everybody.
your week. Thanks.
Yeah, you too. See you guys.
Bye.
Thanks.
Yep.